By college rules, classes are in session until noon, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. If you can't make it, you can access the video recording of it, which we posted on YouTube. And also, they have someone here who will be taking notes, and you can make an arrangement with that person to share notes with you. Okay, so let me, as that goes around, let me just indicate my agenda for today. I'm going to finish our discussion of Reed. We're not covering the entire book, but good portions of it. And then we're going to move on to look at U.S. health policy and politics, which is the rubric I'm using to describe the basic events, obviously in very quick, rough steps, from the implementation of Medicare in the mid-60s until the passage and first years of the Affordable Care Act in the early 2010s. The Affordable Care Act was passed after a major political struggle in March 2010, and there's a struggle going on about the Affordable Care Act to this very day. I won't cover all of that, but I will get us at least until about mid-2011, perhaps, by the time we finish, if I can hit all the points I want to in the time that's left. So we're going to start by looking at the last two examples of countries with health systems that Reed discusses that are of relevance to us, and those are Taiwan and Switzerland. And the reason that they are important especially is that they coincide in their history and politics in the 1990s with a major failure of U.S. health policy and politics under the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton was elected in '92 with a strong commitment to health reform as a major part of his agenda. And he began in '93 to move in that direction, created a commission of which Hillary Clinton was famously the public face. There were lots of people on this commission that were supposed to be designing the program. The program was leaked in bits and pieces over the summer of '93, introduced in September '93, and then went into a major political tailspin in '93 and '94, and was never actually introduced to be voted on in Congress because it had gone so sour by that time. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then beyond, from bridging from the Clinton failure to the Obama success, with some interesting carryover of personnel who were eyewitnesses to what went wrong with Clinton's attempt, who tried to guide Obama to not make the same mistakes again. We'll talk about that when we get to that point. But at the same time that these events were spinning out, and sometimes out of control in the U.S., both Taiwan and Switzerland moved forward with health reform and joined those many other countries that had built the system on the basis of solidarity and learned lessons from other places. Both countries deliberately tried to find out what was working well, not so well, in other countries, and came up with their own designs that were significant syntheses of the best features of other programs. Taiwan did it more systematically with a special commission, with a very interesting American who was playing a role, a man who came originally from Beijing, William Shao, key player in the story. Switzerland did it a little less systematically, but nestled as it is in its particular place in Europe, in a way between Germany and France. It looked to both systems very carefully and borrowed significant features from them in designing its own law, which then passed by a referendum. So let's look at these two accounts. Taiwan is discussed by Reed, pages 166 to 176. And his account begins with a bit of background on the Cold War, and that was on top of the background story of the Chinese Revolution, with the nationalist government essentially being either banished to or fleeing to Taiwan, the island off the mainland of China, which China has never recognized as a separate independent country. But in any case, Taiwan built its own national identity, and out of that national identity came some very interesting developments and people. One of the people who plays a major role in all this was William Shao. His father had been an official in the nationalist government, and so Shao himself was born in Beijing, but with his family moved to, or were forced to, go to Taiwan. Later, his father, William Shao's father, became an official in the UN delegation for Taiwan. So we had this crazy Cold War thing that made sense only in the Cold War, but doesn't make sense to most people. Otherwise, the huge nation of China was not represented in the UN until the 1970s, but this tiny little island of, call them renegades of losers, whatever, in Taiwan was represented as China in the UN. And that was obviously a major bit of Cold War politicking. So William Shao's father was part of that delegation, and like many, many Chinese people in the New York area, settled in Flushing, New York, in Queens, which developed a very, very robust Chinese community. And I'm told by people who are in the know, and I have a friend who lives in Flushing, who did a PhD on Chinese economics in the 70s in Canada, is now teaching in the SUNY system in New York and living in Queens, who really loves Chinese cuisine, that the best variety and the best quality of Chinese cuisine anywhere in the United States, and perhaps even the world, I'm told, is in Flushing, Queens. So those of you who have the possibility of trying it out, try it out. Anyway, William Shao grew up and he got a job. He did some work in statistics, educationally, and got a job as an actuary in the Social Security Administration. He worked his way up and became the chief actuary, the chief quantitative analyst in the Social Security Administration, who would figure out all those details that needed to be done in order to make sure that Social Security would be solvent and would be paying appropriately and collecting appropriately and so on. All of that is important to understand his perspective, because the Social Security Administration and its ethos as an agency is what shaped Medicare. The people who designed Medicare as a strange, alternate, universal U.S. program for those only who reach Social Security retirement age of 65, that agency, with that commitment, is the agency to which William Shao was committed. So he believed strongly in Medicare. He believed strongly in a program that should be universal, at least for an age category. He believed that there should be one program run for the country and not separate variants in the various states. And he believed that it could be financed, and was financed successfully, as was Social Security in general, by mandatory payroll deductions rather than by taxation directly, and to which employers also contributed, only topped out with some tax revenues, but not, this was not a system that would tax people as for the British National Health Service provisions, but rather this was a contributory program, which gave people an earned entitlement to these benefits. That's the agency he grew up with, that was the culture he believed in, and those are the ideas that he brought with him later to Taiwan. As Reed tells the story about Shao, late in life, when he realized that there were more things that he wanted to learn and master and be challenged by, he went for his PhD. He had only a master's degree, or maybe a couple of master's degrees until that point, even though he had reached this very high level within the Social Security Administration. He went to Harvard, got his PhD in health economics and policy, and at age 50, when he completed that, he now began to play a role on the world stage. He was recognized as a man of great depth and sophistication and subtlety, and became a consultant to many countries around the world on ways of helping improve or extend their various health systems. By the early 1990s, Taiwan had reached a stage of significant economic development. It had become what Reed calls one of those new Asian tigers, quote unquote, that was the term used at the time, in the 70s and 80s, which developed very successful, robust capitalist economies. Taiwan was a very capitalist country. It had democratic institutions, but it was strongly committed to development of its economic system. And leaders of the country began to realize around 1990 that though they were a major power internationally in economic terms, they seemed quite far behind in the development of social institutions and hadn't developed the way other robust economies were developing. And so they felt, the leaders of the country felt, that there was a need for very dramatic change in its healthcare system. In 1994, as Reed tells the story, a conservative government, not a progressive or left-leaning government, but a conservative government, led by business leaders, perhaps because they were embarrassed by comparison to other leading nations that were doing well economically at that time, thought that their healthcare system was an embarrassment. It was a relic. It was maybe more like India's than it was like that of the European countries that they admired, Germany, France, and so on. And so they decided to do something about that, create a commission, and move forward. William Shao, because of his connections to family loyalty, his father's official position in the Taiwanese government, and who had recently earned his PhD at Harvard and was very respected around the world for his health insights, was called upon to serve the Taiwanese government. And he took on this role, undertaking a systematic study of the features of other countries that he thought were good and those that he thought were not so good. This is all laid out pages 170 to 171. He also did something very, very clever. He didn't want to just come up with a report, spend months or maybe a year producing this massive 1,000-page document, whatever, and then have it just lay on people's desks without being read or engaged with. And so he came up with a plan that was accepted by the people in charge of Taiwanese government at times, that each major government minister, the Minister of the Interior, the Minister of Finance, the Defense Minister, whatever, would take a particular country's plan and become the expert on that plan based on the information that Shao had collected, and then become its advocate in internal debates within the government. So this official was the advocate for France, this other official was the advocate for Germany, and this third person for Canada, whatever. And therefore they each had a major stake in those systems. They wouldn't just let this fancy report drift over their heads. They would play a major role and be actively engaged in the discussions. And that's the way the process went. And emerging from that process was a remarkable sort of compilation and composite that had some features from other systems. So, for example, the basic way revenues were to be collected were through premiums. That was like the U.S. Medicare system or Social Security system that Shao knew so well. But in terms of national examples, it was like the Canadian system, that is Medicare through a single-payer system throughout the population. Other features were administrative efficiency. And so this carte vitale, this special smart card that was used in France, would be a good idea. That's where Taiwan got the idea of the smart card, which, as we have it in the film, is kind of backwards. We see it in Taiwan. We don't learn about France. It's not one of the examples, but in fact it was borrowed from France and then, with some modifications, adjusted for the Taiwanese environment. There was also, Shao thought, a very important role to be played by central policy making and price setting, as in Japan and in France. So these various features were put together with many, many others and many details, and the national insurance law consolidating these dimensions was passed in 1994. The system was up and running in March 1995 and has been judged by analysts ever since as a major success. This is the way Reed describes some of its successes on page PH116. As a system started from scratch with uniform rules and procedures for every doctor and patient and state-of-the-art paperless record keeping, Taiwan's new health insurance system is the most efficient in the world. The 1994 law seemed hopelessly optimistic when it set a limit of 3.5% for administrative costs. In fact, the system has done much better than that, with paperwork, etc., accounting for only 2% of costs most years, and sometimes even less. That's about the same administrative cost rate of the U.S. Medicare system. Not a big surprise given Xiao's background and experience. But that's 1/10 as high as the administrative burden for America's private insurers. That is 20% as compared to 2%. As a result, even with explosive growth in the consumption of medical services, national health spending in Taiwan remains at about 6% of gross domestic product as opposed to 17% of GDP in the United States. This has kept costs low for patients. As we saw, there are general complaints and the usual sorts of things that happen in every complicated system, but in Reed's assessment and the assessment of most health economists and policy analysts who have looked at it, Taiwan has made a great success of its health reform efforts. And we owe a lot of that to an American born in Beijing, part of the Taiwanese government and culture through his father, living in Flushing, New York in his youth, William Xiao. Let's turn quickly to Switzerland, which is covered by Reed, pages 177 to 182. Switzerland, by the late 80s, early 90s, had a very entrenched system that looked a lot like the U.S. system before any real reforms began, before the Affordable Care Act. And there was, as you might expect, with an entrenched system in which there were a lot of big players, very profitable insurance companies, and the like, a lot of resistance to change. A lot of the language of resistance and a lot of the imagery of resistance was familiar to those who had experienced resistance in the United States. This will lead to a big brother kind of government. This is a trend towards socialism, etc., etc. And the big pharmaceutical companies, which Switzerland is a major hub around the world, major global center for transnational pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, paid for that kind of propaganda to resist the movement in this direction. The description of what Switzerland was like before reforms began is summarized on pages 179 to 182 in Reed. Many people in Switzerland, from all over the political spectrum, the right as well as the left, began to understand clearly that the healthcare system in Switzerland undermined the principle of solidarity, of solidarity. And that didn't compute. Something was wrong. There was a major discrepancy that had to be somehow dealt with. And it led to a demand for reform. Reed talks about this on the bottom of page 178. As he puts it, quoting President Gu Xiaoping, Gu Xiaoping came from the conservative side of the political spectrum. He was not one of the liberals or progressives. He was from something called the Christian Democratic Party, more or less, as Reed puts it, the European version of American Republicans. But even he began to come along as the campaign developed, and is quoted by Reed here as saying, a society cannot have complete equality, Gu Xiaoping said. It's not possible. You can earn more money than your neighbor, but that is not society's business. But a good railway system, a good school system, a good health system, the basic needs of the people must be handled with a high degree of equality. This is very much like the French views that have been quoted. We cannot equalize all things, but we can equalize some things, and we can make very important national commitments to having an efficient and equally accessible rail system and so on. And why is the healthcare system any different? It is not. So for that, we need the needs of the people must be handled with a high degree of equality. To have a great sense of solidarity among the people, all must have an equal right, and particularly an equal right to medical care. It is a profound need of the people. If they are struck by a stroke of destiny, they must at least have a good healthcare system. Our society must meet that need. And that was how a leading conservative politician formulated things after a major campaign led, of course, initially by the Swiss left, the Swiss labor organizations, parties on the left, but it led eventually to a commission to study the various options, and it also led to a national referendum. The Swiss were not going to decide this by contested votes in the legislature, understanding there was heavy lobbying and strong investment from those enterprises, insurance, commercial insurance, and commercial, the pharmaceutical industry that might stand to lose. So that would make the vote in the legislature compromise. Let's go to a national referendum. And the referendum was on what was called the new law of sickness, Lamal. Lamal passed in a referendum. But the country decided in 1994, once that referendum was a success, that the country would move forward, and gave itself 2 years to 1996 to implement the system, to work out the details, and make it up and running. And what the law did, by borrowing important features of the French and the German systems as well as others, it required all insurance companies to offer the basic package of benefits with no allowable profit. Companies were allowed to sell supplemental insurance if they wanted to, and could use their efficient and friendly delivery of the benefits under the basic core plan as a way of marketing their particular value as a company, and would use that to sell their supplemental insurance. So those companies did compete on that basis, and after some startup hiccups and the usual complaints and difficulties, the companies in Switzerland providing insurance discovered that by providing the basic benefits, not for profit as required by the new law, and marketing for-profit supplemental plans, they were able to come out as well or better as they had been before the new plan went into effect. They have done quite well financially. The Swiss insurance industry is very, very profitable, even more profitable than it had been, because there's more of a consumer base. Yes?
So in this sense, is Switzerland more like the French system in that all insurance companies have to offer like a basic structure plan?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Right. Very French in that regard. Not the German 200 volt varieties and so on, but even the Germans have to have a basic core set of basic features of that plan, although the Germans can opt out. The Swiss didn't give that opt-out, as far as I remember, that opt-out option was more like French. And even the title of it, it's called La Malle, which is French, so that probably indicates some of its flavor and tone. Turns out, given how late they started and how strong the commercial insurance industry remains and how central transnational pharmaceutical companies are in Switzerland, the Swiss healthcare system is generally, compared to others around the world, pretty expensive. In fact, it's the second most expensive compared to the United States. There's a considerable distance between the U.S. in terms of percentage of GDP, of per capita investment, and so on, but it's still way up there and above most of the other countries that we've looked at because of these features that continue. And yes, solidarity is an essential feature of the system, and there is a margin in the right direction between it and the USA in terms of percentage investment. The solidarity principle is crucial, and there is an interesting story that was aired on NPR, National Public Radio, which was then transcribed, and I have a transcription of this particular program. The NPR health reporter, an analyst you may occasionally have heard, is a woman called Julie Rovner, R-O-V-N-E-R. And she spent a lot of time in Switzerland and lots of other places, filed reports. This is a report that appeared. The timing is interesting. July 31st, 2008. Why would NPR air a program about Switzerland and Switzerland's reforms in middle of 2008? Well, it was in the middle of a presidential campaign. In fact, it was not yet decided who would be the Democratic candidate. It was leading up to the conventions and etc. And so Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who had very different views by that time, were duking it out, and McCain was running for president as the Republican front runner, then the candidate, and they had very different views, but healthcare was an important part of 2008 campaign, so why not look at Switzerland and see what happened there. So here is a selected transcript of the account. At first glance, Switzerland's healthcare system looks like it could be a perfect political compromise for the United States. As Republicans would prefer, individuals, not employers of the government, choose from a broad array of health plans sold by private insurance companies. So there is in effect an individual mandate. You have to have insurance, but then you can choose a variety. Your employer won't choose, but once you choose, your employer will make a matching contribution, but it's your choice. And as Democrats urge, everyone in Switzerland has health coverage. It's required by law, once Lamal passed, with the government providing generous subsidies for those who couldn't otherwise afford it. Switzerland's 7.5 million citizens are, by and large, quite happy with the system. I wouldn't trade it for the world, says Nicole Vieri, an adult vocational education instructor from Lucerne. I think it's a very good system. And then she quotes Professor Peter Zweifel. I think we saw him on the film, who was a professor of health economics at the University of Zurich. He is quoted as saying, surveys showed the population was skeptical with this new law work and so on. But he was someone who helped the government officials write the law. They began to figure, though, hey, now that poor people are forced into a system that quite likely will become more expensive as time goes on, they don't have a way to opt out anymore. So it's really going to hurt poor people. They're required to be in the system. Prices go up. They're already straining to pay. What's going to happen to poor people? Middle class and wealthy people will do quite well. So pressure began to develop in Switzerland to develop another crucial feature of the plan. As Zweifel said, pressure began to increase that the poor shall have a subsidy, a personalized subsidy of the health insurance premium, which is built into the Affordable Care Act for those people who buy insurance on the exchanges, and that Trump has by executive order tried to eliminate, and in many ways has successfully eliminated by executive action. And that's created some turmoil in the insurance markets, and we'll get to that at the very end of the course when we look at where things stand with the Affordable Care Act and attempted repeal and so on and so forth. So pressure began to develop in Switzerland. How can we have a country which is built on solidarity and make it more difficult rather than less difficult for poor people? They're now required to be part of the system, and as premiums go up, they're going to suffer more and more because their wages are obviously not going to go up as quickly, if they go up at all, as do insurance premiums. So there needs to be a subsidy. Became one of the major features of the Swiss solution. Yet even with a subsidy, there's a regressive aspect of the Swiss system, because health insurance premiums were not linked to income. They were flat, like a flat tax. So everyone pays the same. I pay what I pay. Someone in Switzerland is quoted, but my neighbor pays 400 francs also, even though she has a salary which is half mine. And here's the Swiss completion of that thought. It's not a typical American completion. Typical American completion, well, that's too bad. We are a free market economy. Right? Not in Switzerland. I pay what I pay, but my neighbor pays 400 francs also, although she has a salary which is half mine. And that's unfair, she said. And so we've got to do something about that. particular person who was quoted, a woman named Rapaz, keeps the bills that she collects in a 3-ring binder. She pays 400 Swiss francs per month for a basic coverage. Her employer contributes 60 francs towards that overall coverage. Individuals, however, can adjust their premiums up or down by choosing a large or small annual deductible or by joining an HMO type plan that requires them to choose a doctor within the network. Those are the kinds of things that happen when we make choices in our university plan. You could reduce the amount of premium you pay by adjusting certain features. I'm willing to pay more deductible, more upfront costs. I will take only doctors in the system. I won't go out of it, etc. Those are the kinds of choices that the Swiss could make also. But there is still this fundamental discrepancy between what people pay and what they really could afford to pay. So as the conversation ends, and I want to end with this, Rapaz looks puzzled when asked about people in the United States who say it would be intrusive to mandate health insurance. So she looks at the reporter, who states that accurately, as an American view, and says, I'm not sure that I get you. What are you talking about? Cocking her head to one side. When the question is put another way, she laughs. Oh, I see. That's really an American question. You are so used to having this individualistic way of thinking. That's why you don't have these social safety nets. You still have this pioneer mentality when everyone has to take care of himself. Shoot 'em up! Ah! The American Wild West frontier as a continuing political ideology. That's not how people in Switzerland think about it. No. There are a bunch of people who need a social safety net. And she adds, I'm really happy to give part of my salary to a solidarity system. That's what makes our country civilized. And remember President Khushbin, when asked by Reed, and said, you know, many Americans wouldn't understand what you're saying and what the Swiss seem to be committed to, because they, in America we say, well, everyone has a right to legal defense and everyone has a right to education and so on and so on. But not health care. We don't think of health care the same way. And Khushbin looks at him, remember this is a conservative politician, and just says in utter disbelief and confusion, why? What's the matter with you people? Or as the French say, the Americans are so clever about so many things. Why couldn't they figure this out? So we're going to have to look at American culture, values, and history. And that is my transition to the American story. Going back to 1966 and trying to rush forward in a lecture and a half to 2010 roughly, let's see how we can hit some of the high points. We know that Medicare was an alternative to a national universal system aimed at a particular age group, but with the hopes of some, including its designers, that it would be generalized and universalized through the age spectrum once that plan was established. Wilbur Mills, one of those politicians who was most worried about that plan and opposed to it, tried to keep it contained by building various fences around it. Fences that would absorb the political demand for universalization. Medicaid was one such fence. Medicare Part B was another such fence. He knew, he was worried that there would be pushes for extension and universalization. And he was right. Very soon after Medicare was implemented, in 1966, major labor leaders came out in favor of a universal plan. Walter Reuther, who was the leader of the United Auto Workers, very powerful union at that time, gave the keynote speech at the 1968 American Public Health Association meeting, in which he said it is time to launch again a plan for a battle for universal health insurance, Medicare for all. Very soon after that, in early 1969, APHA usually holds its meeting in early November. So a few months after that, Senator Ted Kennedy became a major political proponent of legislation to create a Medicare for All program with all its essential features in the United States, and began to advocate for it and to try to collect allies within Congress. By the early 1970s, what happened is that everyone tried to jump on the bandwagon because the assumption, remarkably, in the early 1970s in the United States was, yes, we will indeed soon have a national health program, a universal national health program. The fact that we will have it is not to be questioned. The structure of it, how it will be designed, what the particulars and the subtleties is to be disputed. And so instead of people opposing any attempt to create a national health program and jumping on those old red-baiting bandwagons, at least for most, in the early 1970s, the question was, how do you want to design it? And so there was a Republican version, there was a Democratic version, there was a subversion, different mainstream Democratic version, Ted Kennedy, more progressive, etc., etc. President Nixon, who was not known as an actively liberal politician, to put it mildly, came up with his own version of a national health plan. His would essentially leave everything intact, give people more substantial tax breaks, write-offs if they bought health insurance to incentivize more people to buy it, and extended Medicaid, that is a sort of safety net program, supposedly more broadly to make it more generous and less difficult to get. So it was essentially taking the existing system and extending various pieces of it in piecemeal fashion, which was very different from Ted Kennedy's version, who wanted universalization of Medicare on its basis. The momentum for reform seemed so great that even, I know this is going to be hard to believe, even the AMA, which since the 19 teens had been a vigorous, active opponent of any sort of movement towards a national health program, had campaigned against Medicare, had paid Ronald Reagan to record a record condemning Medicare as the beginning of socialism in the United States, and so on. Even the AMA in the 1970s came up with its version of a universal national health plan. It was everywhere. The only question seemed to be which version of it would we have, or which combination of things would put it together. But then economic crisis hit the United States and a good part of the world. The 1970s became the decade of stagflation. Prices were going up, that's inflation, but the economy was stagnant or even contracting. That's the stagnant part of it. There was a major, terrifying oil embargo in which the oil-producing nations from the Middle East put very strict limits on it. The oil prices went up. Oil became, that is gasoline, became very, very difficult. Anyone who lived through the 70s and was conscious at that time, above the age of maybe 12, I don't know, will remember vividly people lining up for hours trying to get gas from the local gas station because the supply was so limited, and maybe after a 2 or 3 hour wait, having to go away without being filled up because the pumps ran dry before people could fill up their car. This terrified people. At the same time that this was happening to the economy, and this first time the American economy was not in a robust growing phase since World War II. It was in fact a robust growing phase of the U.S. economy in the 60s that helped fund not only the Vietnam War, but also helped fund those major social programs, helped fund the programs to give people additional benefits and food stamps and so on. Because, well, we have so much, we might as well be able to put a little bit, at least, into social programs for the poorest and most challenged. We have a little bit of an excess. That changed dramatically in the 70s. It became the lifeboat syndrome. Who are you going to save? And people, of course, with means and power were trying to save themselves. We can't afford to move in the direction of universal health care, especially when we have evidence from Medicare inflation and inflation of healthcare prices generally, how rapidly the healthcare sector is inflating. Some of that was built into the very foolish form of cost plus retrospective reimbursement that was just a magnet for inflationary behavior on the part of health institutions. All those things contributed to this massive sense of crisis. Our economy generally is stuttering and stagnating and creating challenges. We are no longer in this robust growth phase. We're going to have to make contractions and make decisions and priorities. At the same time, the healthcare sector was growing by leaps and bounds and inflating wildly, well above any other rate of increase in the economy. So how could we possibly consider going to a universal health program in this environment? That became clear by the mid-70s. So it was clear in Jimmy Carter, who was elected as president as a Democrat in 1976. And at that point, when he was campaigning, he made a commitment to some version of universal health insurance. It wasn't Kennedy's version, but it was a version of it, more sort of like Nixon, more in the middle. But by 1978, midway through his term as president, he backed away from that, said, no, I cannot support that anymore. It was only really Teddy Kennedy who kept persisting as a leading Democratic politician, trying still to get national health reform, but everyone else had gotten off the bandwagon they had jumped on a couple of years before. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won the presidency, and Reagan was committed to a policy of cutting back government funding for all social programs. He believed that his mantra was, the government is not the solution to the problem, whatever the problem may be, government is the problem. And the way we achieve a new robust economy, this was his vision, it's still a vision of many Republicans, if not all Republicans, is that we have to free the economy of shackles, as they perceive them, of any kind of oversight and restraint and regulation, allow the market to be freer, and somehow the freer, more robust market will start booming. It's a fantasy, but that's the fantasy that has power. In fact, the economy, when Reagan's policies went into effect, contracted, and there was a major recession in the early years of the Reagan administration. That was the economic reality. But the dream, the fantasy, the ideology is that if we remove restraints, the economy will boom, everyone will benefit, and then the country will be back on track. So we have to free the market, and we have to cut back social programs. He cut back Medicaid. He cut back food stamps. He cut back all sorts of job training programs by significant amounts. It was a cruel axe that he took. He tried to cut back Medicare as well. But he realized, and his political advisors realized, that cutting back Medicare would be different and very much more difficult than any of the other cuts that he thought was necessary in order to deregulate the government and free us of government entanglements. So here is the basis for an incredibly important irony that had very major ramifying effects. If you cut back benefits for Medicare beneficiaries, you will have a major political blowback, because those covered by Medicare, very well represented by AARP and other organizations like that, are a powerful voting bloc. In general, the over 65 population is the most informed, the most likely to vote, the most politically representative voting bloc in the country. And Reagan and his advisors knew well enough that they didn't want to tangle with them directly. But we have to, in this economic crisis, somehow cut back the Medicare budget. Well, if we can't cut back on beneficiaries directly, well, what can we do? We'll cut back how much we pay providers to provide the care that the beneficiaries are entitled to. We won't change entitlements. We won't make it look as if we're trying to go after the elderly who have earned this entitlement to medical care. But we're going to make their providers, their doctors and their hospitals, have to do things more efficiently, or at least differently, so that we can get this Medicare budget under control given our economic needs. This was the motivation for the transformation from retrospective, cost-based payment to prospective payment. Major fundamental change. There's a great irony in this. The prospective reimbursement system, beginning for Medicare and then extending broadly by copying and trying to get ahead of the curve, the commercial insurance industry, which adopted similar proposals so they wouldn't be left behind. Prospective reimbursement was based on what was called DRGs, diagnosis-related groups, where analysts for years had studied how you can group symptoms, and if you have this set of symptoms or this diagnosis, then a good hospital with appropriate trained staff and the proper equipment could deliver that care for X amount of dollars. Whatever it is. So if its diagnosis 1.73, that was worth a certain amount of dollars. And they tested this out. There were field tests in various states in the late 70s. It was a program that had begun under the Carter administration. But there it was on a shelf. Here's this great irony. As a way of cutting costs in Medicare substantially by imposing DRGs, which was essentially a fee schedule. Only initially, but then by copying very widely, broadly, for Medicare patients getting reimbursement, whether hospitals, doctors, for services provided to Medicare patients. It's a fee schedule, essentially functioning like the fee schedules in Japan or France, which means very centrally organized and very heavily imposed. Imposed during the Reagan administration, which was ideologically committed to less government. Here was one of the most regulatory, top-down government impositions because Reagan and his advisors were desperate to try to find ways of saving money in the Medicare system, and the only way they could think of doing it, was a good way, was to impose a new form of reimbursement. But the ideology is unshackled government, free as of regulatory control, and then imposing the most regulatory, centralized method of reimbursement one could imagine. That's ironic. Also ironic is the plan was designed during the Carter administration by Carter-era economists and analysts. When Reagan was desperate for finding a way to deal with Medicare costs and knowing that politically he couldn't cut benefits to very well organized and vocal Medicare beneficiaries, he took this plan off the shelf that had been put there by the Carter administration and administered it, created it during his own administration. It's one of the great ironies of our healthcare history. And that transition from Medicare retrospective payment to prospective payment is very nicely discussed in a few places in Shi and Singh. Let me give you those pages. You should read them carefully. 229, 259, and 299 to 300. The imposition of Medicare prospective payment led to a cascade of major changes throughout the entire U.S. health system. We're going to have to stop here. Stay tuned for this cascade of major changes that came as a consequence of the imposition of prospective payment through DRGs under Reagan in a way that seemed ideologically inconsistent but made sense politically at that time.